Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today we are here for an October wrap-up. October was a fantastic reading month for me. I managed to finish so many books. I think this was kind of a rebound from September, in which I read very few books since I was on vacation. So I came home just like amped up to really buckle down and get into my reading list. What I ended up reading in October was a lot of thrillers and a lot of horror, but also I cleared a lot of books off of my NetGalley shelf, which I'm really excited about. I have been needing to catch up on some of the books there, and so I feel like I did a pretty good job of doing that this month. In total, I read 27 books in the month of October. That calculates out to 8,902 pages, or an average of 330 pages per book. In terms of fiction to nonfiction, I read 7% nonfiction and 93% fiction. So those are pretty decent numbers for me. I usually tend to be around 5% nonfiction, and I've been kind of working to do a little bit better. And so I'm happy to see that come up just a little bit. My top 5 genres for the month of October were literary, mystery, fantasy, thriller, and horror. Now let me tell you about the books that I read. I'm going to be breaking them down by my star ratings. I am going to be starting with my 2 stars and working my way up to my 5 stars. If you're wondering watching these videos why I never have any 1-star reads, it's because I don't typically rate a book 1 stars. For me, like a 1-star means that the book was unfinishable. It was so bad that I couldn't get through it. So if I've finished the book, if I've managed to complete it, I'll typically at least give it a 2 stars. It's very, very rare that I'll give a book a 1 star. So first in the 2-star category, I have How to Be Eaten by Maria Adelmann. This is a take on different fairy tales with a modern twist. We have 5 different women who have survived various traumas in their lives, and they get together for a support group in New York City. This sounds really interesting. I wanted to love this book. Unfortunately, the execution was really off on this. Of the 5 stories that were being told by the women, I feel like there was only 2 that were really interesting, and the rest I just couldn't care less. I found the book grating and annoying. I found the motivations of one of the characters that's like orchestrating everything to be super frustrating. It just was a book that had so much potential and didn't go the places that I wanted it to go. Then we had Midnight is the Darkest Hour by Ashley Winstead. I cannot tell you how much I hated this book. I struggle with the thriller genre. I love a good thriller, but I don't find good thrillers very often. Instead, I find something like this, which is super convoluted, completely out there, not realistic at all. And the problem that I have is it's supposed to be set in reality. This isn't a fantasy or a sci-fi. The author hasn't conditioned me to accept that there's aliens or elves or something that I know that doesn't exist in the real world to justify like just this crazy all over the place plot. Instead, you have a book that is anchored in a society that people are familiar with and with rules that function the way our world works. And then all of a sudden it just goes completely off the rails. This honestly was one of the worst thrillers I've read this year. I cannot understand how people are raving about this author or raving about this book. I thought this was terrible. And then I'm super sad to say this because I didn't think this was going to happen. In fact, Luna has even come over to give me some emotional support while I talk about this. But I read the book Family Lore by Elizabeth Acevedo and I rated it at 2 stars. So I have read The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, and I have a couple of her other books on my TBR shelf. I liked The Poet X. I was hoping that I was gonna like Family Lore. The premise of it sounded really interesting. We have a family member who can predict death. We have a bunch of siblings that have superpowers of sorts. And I just thought this was gonna be a really cool multi-generational family drama. I thought I was gonna explore relationships and like mysticism and spirituality and stuff. And it was really strange. It was all over the place. It felt very YA, except we have one character whose superpower has to do with her ability to have sex. So there was all of this like sexual explicit content that was suddenly jammed in, and it didn't really feel like it was for a good reason. There were some really gruesome scenes in particular, and I am all for a woman that knows her value, knows what she brings to the table. I am totally sex positive. I'm happy that there's a character that represents that sex positivity, that's comfortable in her skin and comfortable with her sexuality. But there was just some stuff that was included in this book that really grossed me out and kind of just took me out of that character. I don't know what happened here, but this just was not for me. And then I had Masters of Death by Olivie Blake. This was a book that I picked up via NetGalley as an ARC. I have read Olivie Blake's previous series, the Atlas 6 and the Atlas Paradox, and it was okay. I will admit that dark academia is just not my vibe, really. I've tried quite a few popular dark academia books, and I keep trying because I want to like it, but I just find it overly pretentious, and it kind of all feels the same to me. Having had a bit of luck with the Atlas 6 series, I thought, well, why don't I try Masters of Death? Unfortunately, I could not convince myself to care about this book. It was so boring. I kept picking it up and putting it down, picking it up and putting it down, and making progress through this book. I felt like swimming through a pool of molasses. It just was so dry and so boring. I didn't like the narrative of the book. I didn't like anything about it, really. I barely remember any of the details because I was just so bored out of my mind with it. And then I have I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. I don't actually think that this was a bad book. I just think this is the case of I didn't really get this book. I have seen other booktubers who I really respect that really like this book, so I might be kind of the outlier here. I do have a feeling that this book is very polarizing. It's like a love it or hate it type of book, and I just happen to be in the hate it category. We have a main character who is really dysfunctional. She's going through a lot, and she's very fixated on certain people, and it's about her relationship with different people and this fixation, and it just, for me, I don't know, there was something missing with it. It wasn't creepy, it wasn't like suspenseful or thrilling, it wasn't like a drama where you really like sink into the conflict. I don't know, it just, for me, it kind of felt superficial and not long enough to really explore what was going on here. Then we're gonna get into our 3-star category. So for me, a 3-star is like a C rating. This means that the book was decent, it passed the class, but it's not something that I'm gonna like rave about. It's probably not something I'm gonna remember in great detail a year from now. I mean, I'll remember that I read it, of course, and I'll probably remember a bit about what the book is about, but it's not gonna like stand out in my mind as vividly as a 4 or 5 stars. So first up, I have The Death of Jane Lawrence by Caitlin Starling. This has been on my bookshelf for a couple years. I bought it in 2021 for a horror haul, and I loved the cover. That's what initially drew me to it. I didn't really know much about this author or about this book. What we got was a gothic fiction of a young woman named Jane who marries a doctor in town. Their marriage is a business arrangement. Jane proposes that she's an accountant, she can help him with his business. She just needs a man in her life because she doesn't really have anyone to provide or take care of her. She's kind of orphaned, and the funds that have been caring for her up until this point are just not going to be sufficient for her to continue on. So they enter this arrangement very, very in the mind of business. They're not going to live together, and there's one rule: she can never ever visit her husband's home at night. So she quickly breaks that rule, and we find out why. Her husband's kind of creepy, he keeps kind of creepy company, and there's some kind of creepy stuff going on at the mansion. I felt like this book was about 100 pages too long. I think the first 200 pages or so were super interesting, and then after that point it kind of went off the rails. If the ending had been a little bit clearer and more concise, and I think if it had been cut off a little bit earlier than it had, it could have been a 4-star book. But I think that it just, like, the last third of the book for me was what really knocked it down a star. Then I have Hemlock Island by Kelley Armstrong. This was a book that I received through NetGalley, and this is what I would call like eco-horror or an eco-thriller. We have a woman who owns a cabin on an island in Lake Superior, and it is like the only cabin on this particular island, and she rents it out for Airbnb guests. And then all of a sudden, mysterious things start happening. An Airbnb guest reports that there is blood in a closet, that there's all sorts of strange stuff going on. And her ex-husband, who are currently in like a weird separation, go to the island to check it out. Other people ended up on the island with her, including a guy that she has a very complicated and uncomfortable history with, and his sister, and then her daughter. And so it's interesting enough. Initially, I think the suspense and the tension built really well. We have 5 people, they're trapped in a remote, isolated area, they have no way to call for help. Things start happening really fast. I thought the buildup was really good. Again, this is another book where the ending really went off the rails for me. This book was anchored in reality initially, and then all of a sudden we get like a supernatural twist, which for me, if I had known it was going to go in that supernatural direction, I probably would have avoided it. It's just not my cup of tea when a book is, like I said, set in real world with real rules, and then all of a sudden it's just like, bam, we're going in a completely different direction. Then I'm bummed to say I have The Vaster Wilds by Lauren Groff. I absolutely loved Matrix by Lauren Groff. It was one of my favorites last year, I think. And for whatever reason, The Vaster Wilds just didn't connect with me on the same level. It wasn't a bad book. It was interesting listening to this girl and her escape and her survival out in the wilderness in New America. But I don't know, it just was a little bit dull. There wasn't like the wit that Matrix had. I felt like it was a little bit dry. I don't know, it was missing some zazz, something special. It was mostly just a young girl wandering around the woods trying to survive a bunch of injuries and illness. Then I had Absolution by Alice McDermott. This is a book that is set during the Vietnam War era in Vietnam, and it follows two different women who are wives of military soldiers. So these two women, while they are in Vietnam, basically take on the cause of bringing things to different like shelters, orphanages, hospitals. They bring like gift baskets and toys and candies and stuff for the children. And I think they spend a lot of time making themselves feel better about what's going on by trying to do these like good deeds, except a lot of it is about appearances. It's not really about genuinely making a difference. And in that, I think the book is really good. I feel it's very critical of like this voluntourism and like doing good just to get, you know, brownie points basically. I found the characters very unlikable. In particular, there's one character who is just atrocious, and I think she's supposed to be, so that's well written. I found the book kind of boring. I didn't find that there was anything really keeping me super engaged, and it kind of flashes between the current day and the past. I found the current day was kind of boring. I found the past was a little bit more interesting, but it never quite found its footing for me. It was a book I really, again, wanted to love. I thought that concept sounded really interesting, and as it was critical of, you know, white people going to countries that we've invaded and like being like, here's a teddy bear, I hope that makes up for the bomb that we threw on your home. I thought that was such an important message, and I was so disappointed that this just didn't do more. Then I have Murder in Mamon by Mia P. Manansala. This is the fourth book in Tita Rosie's Kitchen series, and I like this book. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just the fourth book in this series, and with most cozy mystery series, I find that after a few books, they start to be very similar. This is the case here. While the plot is not the same as the previous three books, everything else is. We have the same characters, we have the same dynamics, we have the same relationships, we have the same pacing. It's enjoyable. If you enjoyed the first three, you will likely enjoy book number 4, but for me, it's just a 3-star instead of a 4-star, because at this point, it's just really not like anything original or super different. Then we have The Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. So this one was like a 3.5 for me. I really liked the setting. I found it to be somewhat atmospheric, but I did find this book to be a lot more romance heavy than I was expecting. I went into this hoping for like a mystery or a thriller, like a dark horror. This was really giving me that like Halloween vibe. And instead I got a book that was much more focused on a relationship between a man and a woman. There are some creepy elements for sure. And overall, I think it's an enjoyable enough read, but it just isn't that great of a book. And having just read The Once and Future Witches, I found it disappointing because I know how good Alex Harrow can write. I think this was kind of lackluster in comparison. Then I had Love Me Back by Merrit Tierce. This was a bit of a slog. So the good about this book were that the writing is absolutely beautiful. You can tell that Merrit Tierce obviously has some skill. What was hard is this is a book about a woman who works as a waitress, and she is somebody that seems like she's sort of just given up and is using toxic things to kind of numb out the traumas in her life. She's sleeping with a lot of people and not really for much reason. She has a good guy in her life at one point, but she burns that bridge by cheating on him repeatedly until he just gives up on the relationship. And it just is a slog of depressing, but without a lot of point. I never felt like our character was getting any kind of redemption. I never felt like there was any kind of growth. I never felt like there was any kind of point to watching her cycle through these things over and over and over again. I felt like the point was, look at this fucked up person and let's just be really depressed about it. The good thing is that it's a short book, so you know, it's not like reading A Little Life where you're slogging through 800 pages of depressing and trauma porn. It is more like 200 pages of depressing trauma porn. And then I have The Connollys of County Down by Tracey Lange. This is a book that I received from Celadon as an ARC. I'm super grateful to Celadon for providing me with this ARC, but that in no way affects the objectivity of my review. So this book was enjoyable enough. I went through it pretty quickly. It was the first book I read this month. And, you know, there's some family dynamics that were pretty interesting. The plot got moving pretty quickly. I just felt like there was nothing that was super special about this book. Was it an okay read? Absolutely. Would I discourage you from reading it? Probably not. You'll get through it quickly. I don't think you'll hate it. But am I going to tell you that this is going to be your favorite read of the year? I don't think so. Now moving into our 4 stars. The first one that I have is Happiness Falls by Angie Kim. I really enjoyed this book. So I've read 2 books now by Angie Kim, both Miracle Creek and Happiness Falls, and I liked Happiness Falls better than Miracle Creek actually. This is about a family where there's a son with a special disability, he cannot communicate in any way, shape, or form. He isn't able to speak, he's not able to sign, he's not able to use like letter boards, and he's basically like locked into himself. When he is out with his father goes missing and nobody knows what happened. And so they're trying to reach this kid, find a way to communicate with him, to get some kind of clue of what happened to his father. What follows is a discovery that this kid actually is thinking and communicating in his brain. He just doesn't have a way to express himself. And I thought that discussion was super interesting. I love that we have this character that has a chance to express his frustrations at being treated like he is unintelligent or incapable of communicating. It really challenges one's own perceptions of disabilities and what disabilities mean and how we treat disabled people. We see that through the eyes of this whole family who's been dealing with this one person in a specific way, and their reaction to finding out that they've been treating him incorrectly the whole time. I thought that was hands down the best part of the book. I also really appreciated that this book took a look at how police might treat disabled people, especially disabled juveniles when they have specific perceptions of those disabilities. That was a fascinating part of the book as well, although it was a smaller part. And I would say that the mystery element, the father's disappearance, that was good too, but it wasn't the thing that really kept me engaged with the book. You know, I was satisfied with the conclusion, I was satisfied with the lead up to that conclusion, but I found really the family dynamics, and in particular this one brother, much more interesting. Then I read Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I am admittedly not a big classics reader. I have been meaning to read this for a long time. I've had a copy of it on my bookshelves. I keep hearing that it's amazing. I thought it was solid. I gave it a 4 stars because I think it was particularly solid for the time that it was written in. Had it been written today, I don't know that I would have found it quite as thrilling. I don't even know that thrilling is the right word. It's kind of quietly creepy. I think because I've heard so much about this book, I had an inkling of what was going to happen, and I think that might have also ruined some of the suspense of the book for me. So maybe if you're going to try reading this one, go in blind. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to give it away, but basically we have Rebecca who has married a man that she barely knows after a very brief period of time interacting with him, and she arrives at his manor and things are just not the way that she's expecting. The servants are a bit hostile, there's a creepy vibe, his first wife died in a way that is kind of questionable, and things go from there. I think it's worth the read, especially around Halloween time. Is it the best book that I've ever read? Probably not. Is it going to convince me to start reading classics all of a sudden? Probably not. But, you know, was it solid? Sure. Then I have Learned by Heart by Emma Donoghue. This is about Anne Lister, and I didn't actually know much about Anne Lister going in. I have seen previous reviews of this book where people knew much more about her than I did, and I think they found the book a little less interesting. For me, since this was kind of a blank slate, I found it very interesting. It was cool learning about who Anne Lister was, her romances, her journals, and her time in schools, and how she just refused to buckle to the pressures of society. I think if you don't have a lot of information or background history on Anne Lister, you will likely like this book as well. If you are very familiar with her story, I don't know that this is going to do anything really. Then I had Homeward by Angela Jackson Brown. This was a book that I received through NetGalley as my RC, and I absolutely enjoyed this one. This was probably one of my favorites of the 4 stars. I was almost going to rate it 5 stars, but there's just a couple things that held it back for me. This is about the civil rights movement, in particular students that were organizing in student groups to help support the civil rights movement. We have a main character who has been through hell and back. She married a soldier and she ends up pregnant in a kind of a complex situation. Her husband dies in a training accident and she is left to grieve. She then has a miscarriage and is also grieving the loss of a child with that husband. And she's in a really dark place, and her sister takes her to the student organizing group to try to spark some interest in her, spark a passion, bring her back into the world. She meets a man there that kind of sparks some feelings in her that she hasn't felt in a very long time, and that kind of pulls her into the civil rights movement. The thing that I really loved about this book is the way that it portrayed all of the different viewpoints around the civil rights movement at the time. This book focuses in on one family in particular, and it's very interesting. They're not unified at all. The younger part of the family, the children, are super active in the civil rights. They're out wanting to fight and protest. They're doing sit-ins. They're getting arrested. They're doing things that the older generation views as extremely dangerous. And the older generation is really skeptical because they have actually been physically scarred by the violence of segregation and white people in the United States. And so I thought that this book was really thoughtful in how it explored all of the ways that people reacted to civil rights and to that need for them to stand stand up and protest. I think that some parts of this book were maybe a little bit overlong. I think in particular the part about the grief and the relationship, the first little bit of the book, like as you're reading, you're kind of like, where is this going? I didn't love the way that it started. It was a little bit disjointed and a little bit confusing, but once it starts to pick up, it really gets going. So if you decide to read this book, be patient with like the first 50 to like 75 pages, because the story is going to get good from there. And then one of my nonfiction selections, I read The Sister by Sung-Yoon Lee. This is a book that is about North Korea, and it is about Kim Jong-un's younger sister. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but this was fascinating. It basically asserts that she is the brains behind the dictatorship. They talk about how everybody views Kim Jong-un as like the threat, and they view her as like a bit more reasonable and level-headed, but why that perception is so flawed. Basically, it asserts that we're viewing her with a sexist lens, that she couldn't possibly be the evil mastermind, she couldn't possibly be the bloodthirsty dictator because she's a woman. And it's fascinating how we see politicians make that mistake over and over and over again, even though she makes really public comments asserting that like the West are all horrible and that they should be blown up, and she talks trash about South Korea, and she says all of these awful things, and everybody just kind of smiles and writes it off. It's fascinating. The only reason that this didn't become a 5-star for me is that I wanted more. I wanted it to delve a little bit deeper than it did. And maybe that's unfair because we're talking about North Korea, so I doubt that there's like a huge wealth of information available on really anyone in this family or their family history. But I don't know, I felt like I wanted more of her thoughts, more of her internal like motivations. And I think it's an impossible ask. I think overall this is really well written, but I just felt like there was just a little bit more that it needed to be a 5-star. Then I have Mammoths at the Gate by Nifo. This is the 4th book in the Singing Hills cycle, and it was enjoyable. If you've read the 3 previous books in this series, you will likely like this one as well. I don't really have a whole lot to say about it. It's a short, fun read. All 4 books in the series are very short and fun and easy to read. They're well written. Nifo writes in such a beautiful fashion. I think if you like her writing, you'll probably enjoy this series. Then I have The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is an interesting book for me. I didn't necessarily love the YA feel of it, even though I knew going in it was a YA book. It felt very juvenile, but I really admired the way that this is written. Everything is in verse, and I think that that's a hard thing to do and make it successful. So I really admired the effort put into this book. This was definitely a much more successful read than Family Lore. Then I have A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. This is a book I picked up through NetGalley, and I was very excited. I have read Ava Reid previously and had a good time with her, so I was excited to get this one as well. This book is kind of dark academia meets fantasy meets mystery. It is a whole jumble of different genres put together. We have a young woman who gets the chance to go to the house of her favorite author under the guise of being an architecture student. When she gets there, she finds another student who is a literature student who is challenging her favorite author's whole history of works. And the two of them kind of get into like a battle with each other to either verify or discredit this author, and it leads them to some very interesting places. I enjoyed this book. I thought that the mystery element was pretty good. I thought that the suspense creeped up pretty nicely. I liked that while this book is set somewhat realistically, we kind of get the idea from the jump that there's some fantasy elements. So when it starts to kind of twist and go in different directions, it's not just like a complete where the hell did this come from? It makes more sense. I do think that there were some pacing issues. There were parts of the book that dragged a little bit for me. I wanted a little bit more explanation towards the end, but overall, I think if you like Ava Reid's writing, if you like a good fantasy, if you enjoy like a magical mystery, any of those types of elements, you will likely enjoy this book. Now to my 5-star reads. I have 5 stars this month, which is exciting for me because I haven't had that many for quite a while. First up, I have How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water by Angie Cruz. This was such an interesting book. Let me just say, I did not know what to expect going into this. This was a recommendation from my friend Allie Loves to Read over at Instagram. She said this was a book she really enjoyed, and I'm so glad to have picked it up. I will say that if you read this book, I recommend listening to it on audiobook instead of reading the actual physical copy. I started reading the physical copy and then I actually switched to the audiobook, and that added so much life to this story. The narrator is fantastic. So we have an older Dominican woman as our main character, and she's dealing with the loss of her job after the economy collapsed, and she is unable to find work. And basically this book is told through a series of meetings that she has with the unemployment department. She has meetings to talk about what her job skills are and to hopefully find her some work. And through these meetings, we hear all about her life, all about the people that she's cared for, the people she's interacted with, her hopes, her dreams, her fears. It is such a interesting perspective, and it is a voice that I haven't heard in American storytelling very much. So I really, really appreciated what this book does. And the narrator for the audiobook was fantastic. I think this is definitely an interesting book, but a 5-star for me for sure. Then I had Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. This is a true crime thriller mystery sort of a book. We have an unnamed serial killer who has attacked a sorority in Florida, killed a couple girls, injured a couple others. And this book basically follows the president of that sorority as she deals with the fallout. We see the pressure from the media, all the questioning, and it's infuriating. Honestly, I think this book does a really good job of making you understand what it's like to be a woman and to be a victim of a crime, especially if there's a sexual connotation to it. We get the usual, what was she wearing? How many guys was she sleeping with? Do you think that her easy manner brought this upon her? Do you think she's somehow in any way, shape, or form to be blamed or responsible for this atrocity that has been committed against her? And I think this book did it in a really smart way. It doesn't start out that way. It starts in a very sympathetic place, and it kind of builds as we deal with the crime. We also have another woman who's come from across the country that suspects that the serial killer who killed her partner also is involved in this crime. And of course, the police treat her like she's crazy, like she's a hysterical woman that sees zombies everywhere. And just in general, I thought that this was a very sharp critique about how society treats women in relationship to crimes, in relationship to their testimony, in relationship to their feelings, in relationship to their relationships. There was just a ton of really meaningful stuff in this book, and it didn't get weighed down by that heavy messaging. It was still really interesting, fast-paced. The mysteries kept me really engaged. I ripped through this book wanting to know what was happening. And the thing that I really loved about this book too is that this book is based on a very famous serial killer, but they never name him. There is never any reference to him aside from the defendant. And I think at one point they call him the all-American serial killer, but he's never named. And the book is not about him. The book is about the women and their survival. So I really love that. I think more people should do that. I am happy to see a couple books popping up that focus on the victims and not the serial killer. Then I have The September House by Carissa Orlando. I actually really love this book. If you've seen one of my previous videos, which was my 13 horror books you should read for Halloween, you'll already know how I feel about this. If you want to watch that video, look up here for the link. So I loved The September House. This was a recommendation by Jamie Kate, and it was a great recommendation. I, as I've mentioned, have struggled with finding good thrillers. This is definitely a mix of thriller and horror. We have a classical haunted house with ghosts and blood dripping down the walls, but the thing that's unique about it is that it really pops off every September. And then at the end of September, everything settles back down into a normal pace. We have a main character whose husband has gone missing, and we have her daughter who shows up to investigate the husband's disappearance. I will say that I found the daughter extremely grating initially, but I think that's an intentional choice. I think she's supposed to be really hard to tolerate, and she kind of grows on you as the story progresses. I think the thing that is so fascinating about this book is the way that it plays with your perception of what's happening. It makes you perceive the situation as one thing initially, and then a little bit later you start to perceive it as something else, and then you're gonna just bounce back and forth between those perceptions. I changed my mind several times on what was happening here, and it kept me really engaged. I also ripped through this one. I think it took me like a day and a half to get through the whole book, and I really enjoyed it. Then I had Never Whistle at Night, which is a compilation of horror stories by Indigenous authors. It was edited by Shane Hawk and Theodore C. Von Alst Jr. I also mentioned this in the 13 horror books that you should read for Halloween. This is a great anthology. It is a powerhouse of Indigenous authors. There are so many awesome writers in this book. The foreword of the book was done by Stephen Graham Jones. Some of the standout stories for me were by Tommy Orange, Rebecca Roanhorse. There were some that were just so creepy and haunting. There were some that were more like, folkloric or fantasy. It is just a really fun collection, and the cover of this book is absolutely stunning. I think that if you are into horror, you should read this. I think if you're looking for a good book that is about Indigenous cultures by Indigenous authors for Indigenous Peoples Month, which is November, then this would be a fantastic selection to include in your list. And my final 5-star book was How to Say Babylon by Sophia Sinclair. This was a book I had as an ARC from NetGalley, and it was a book that was also featured last month by Book of the Month. Rightfully so. This book is fascinating. I admittedly only know pretty superficial details about Jamaican culture, and this really delves into life in Jamaica, in particular in a Rastafarian family. Sophia's father is a Rastafari, and he is a very conservative Rastafari. He starts out one way, and we see his evolution as he grows through the book and becomes more and more conservative. And we see how that affects the women in his life. We see his reaction to his wife and his reaction to his daughters, and to a lesser degree, his own son. It's really, really interesting. I vaguely knew what a Rastafari was, but I didn't really know what that meant in terms of like spiritual beliefs and, you know, how that affects them, how they're treated in Jamaica, how this culture is viewed by other Jamaicans. And I also was really impressed learning about Sophia and her desire to be a poet and to write, her barriers to education and how she overcame them. Every time she was given a challenge, she found a way to conquer it and keep moving forward. And I thought that that was fantastic. I will say that I listened to this as an audiobook, and I would recommend doing the same as well, because Sophia narrates it herself. And as a poet, she lends such a beautiful quality to the narration. So those are all of the books that I read in the month of October. My average rating for this month was kind of strange. It was a 3.51, and I feel like that's because I had a lot of 2 stars and a lot of 5 stars. So don't think that it was a bad reading month. I had tons of 4 and 5 stars and a decent amount of 3 stars. I just had more 2 stars than usual, and I think that's why that brought that average down. My favorite book of the month was The September House by Carissa Orlando. That one really kind of caught me off guard. I was expecting to just be kind of like meh, because that's how I am almost always with thrillers, and I loved it. I loved it. I loved it. You definitely should read it. My least favorite book of this month was Midnight is the Darkest Hour by Ashley Winstead. I absolutely hated this book. This was like literally the polar opposite of everything I loved about The September House. This didn't lean into supernatural elements initially. It didn't start you out with a setting where you expect ghosts and things like that. It started out in the real world with a woman living in a very sheltered, closed-off religious community with a really controlling father, and then it just completely spiraled off the rails. Considered DNFing it so many times, and it's a book that I kind of wish I had, because at this point it feels like I wasted my time. So that's everything for the month of October. I hope that you found this video interesting. If you did, hit the like button, comment down below, and let me know how you feel about my ratings. Are there any books that I rated a specific way that you feel was completely wrong? Are there any books that you've read out of this list? What did you read in October? Anything that stood out to you? Let me know about your 5-star reads, especially because I want to add 5-star reads to my list. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell, so that you never miss a video, and that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.